So our understanding of antibodies, of natural immunity has changed a great deal from the onset of the pandemic and is still evolving. I understand that the vaccine would help if you catch COVID, and you'll be able to have less symptoms from contracting it. But with me having COVID in the past and having antibodies with my current age group and physical fitness level, it's not necessarily a fear of mine. Taking the vaccine, like I said, it would decrease my chances of having a severe reaction, but it does open me up to the, albeit rare chance, but the possibility of having an adverse reaction to the vaccine itself. I don't believe that being unvaccinated means infected, or being vaccinated means uninfected. You can still catch COVID with or without having the vaccine.
Well, there's Orlando Magic forward Johnny Isaac really laying it out there, the case for a risk-benefit analysis for every individual, and especially for those who have been vaccinated, and the ever-increasing evidence that natural immunity does have some sway in keeping you protected. Gives you memory cells, B cells, T cells, and antibodies or not, you still have some protection, because those cells are like locked and loaded guns. And when a virus intruder comes into your house, they can gear up a response much more quickly than if they hadn't been educated. We can talk more about immunology later, but right now I want to talk with a good friend from PCS Advisers, Paul Seegert, at C_Seegert on Twitter, talking about the impact on the workforce already. Employers can't find workers, and now they're going to, with this vax mandate, what's it going to do? And Paul has his finger on the pulse of that. Good morning, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Hey, so it looks like whether it's the airline industry, whether it is, of course, the healthcare industry, across the land, with, I think, more rules coming down from OSHA, more enforcement rules coming down from Center for Medicaid Services, Medicare and Medicaid Services for healthcare facilities. It's not going to get any better soon, is it? It's only going to get worse.
Well, that's true, and as is often the case with these things, it's going to impact different sized employers in a different way. The one-size-fits-all approach is a lot easier to navigate if you're a really large facility in an urban area with a deep hiring pool and deep resources. But we're seeing the impact on more rural facilities is not as easy for them to navigate. Just think about the cost of testing. When you have a mandate that says you have to get vaccinated or submit to weekly testing, who's going to pay for that? And I'm not against vaccines or anything, but when you just look at the practical implications and the practical implementation that goes on, it's creating a big issue for the smaller employers that are involved.
Well, as the leader of a small rural hospital, I was actually, CNN was up filming our story and our community story, and with the impact that the vaccine mandate, we were proudly, and I was publicly and nationally quoted as being anti-vax mandate for our institution. And wink, wink, come join us, because we're down about 20% of our workforce that have jumped off board to get more lucrative assignments in the nursing realm, traveling positions and so forth. And I'm like, hey, everyone wears N95 masks when we're taking care of patients. Many of the people who are unvaccinated have had the disease. I give credit for that. The data is pretty clear that there's good reason to believe you have great immunity, maybe as good, if not better, than the vaccine. But and CNN was in filming, and they said, how can you do that? What about the danger I said, look, the danger to the patients in our community is coming to the hospital and not having a worker to take care of them when they have an auto wreck or an agricultural wreck or COVID, right? I mean, it's just not practical, Paul. And I don't know there's a blind spot at the government, isn't there?
There's an incredible blind spot in this whole conversation for the duration of the conversation. It's amazing to me that when you look at other countries, the UK is an example. When they're trying to gauge herd immunity in their population, they go out and randomly blood test people. And that's their way of capturing not only those who would have antibodies in their system from vaccination, but also from natural infection and recovery from that. And as you pointed out, study after study shows that is a real thing. But in our mainstream media conversation, we seem to ignore that. In the mandates, we seem to ignore that. Although I think before the presidential announcement, we were starting to see some really good developments there. Kettering Health in Ohio is an example, a significant healthcare employer, added that exemption to their mandate where you could get vaccinated, you could have a medical exemption, a religious exemption, or you could also say, hey, I've had COVID, and submit to an antibody test. And in their policy, they would allow their employees to submit the results of the test quarterly to show that it continued to be in their system and they continued to be protected. And so I thought that's a really smart way to handle it and creative, and it follows the whole body of science, not just the political science that seems to now be driving this conversation so much.
Yeah, I think you're right. We had a really vigorous discussion the other day among the medical staff about whether you even need to prove, in terms of your resistance to severe disease or hospitalization, whether really you'd even need to prove that you have antibodies, because if you've had the disease and you have memory B and T cells, the problem with COVID is that you don't mount an immune response before it has a chance to really replicate, much more rapidly than other viruses. There's a delayed response. That shouldn't be the case, immunologically speaking. They should be able to catch up quickly, those people that have memory cells. But, okay, let's say as a pullback from that, okay, show me your antibodies, whether by vaccine or by infection, and, you're part of the club. You're immune. Come on in. Please work for us.
Right.
That's a reasonable accommodation. I did want to ask you about religious exemptions. What kind of standards are employees going to be expected to meet? Are you going to need something from your shaman, your rabbi, your priest, your pastor, your Wiccan temple leader, or is a personal attestation? What's that looking like?
Well, it very quickly opens up a pretty big can of worms for employers. When they ask for any proof of that, they can open themselves up to lawsuits and liability. So they need to consult with their employment law experts. But the general thinking is that you pretty much have to accept that at face value. That being the case, what's really interesting to me is to see how some employers then are treating that exemption. They're accepting the exemption, but look at United as an example of what I'm saying. They laid off 593 workers. Now, they have a big workforce, 67,000. They laid off 593, and that's what we're talking about mostly in the media right now. What we're not talking about is the 2,000 people who applied for and were granted a religious exemption.
Wow.
But the way that they handled that, so now you have 2,500, 2,600, so 3.7% of their 67,000 workforce. You think of your facility, you can't just tell 3.7% to see you later and still operate okay, but they can. So they did that because of the de facto firing that they applied to those 2,000. They told them, we accept your exemption, but all those that are on a religious exemption are now on unpaid leave. And that was supposed to go into effect yesterday, but naturally it's getting challenged in the courts. Wow. They're getting sued over that, and so they extended it to the 15th of October. So then do you get the exception? And then how are they going to interpret that or treat that in the way that they handle that group of workers? It's a really whole other question.
I heard it reported, and this is second or third hand, okay, but it was told to me that there are CEOs in small rural hospitals and, pretty savvy people that when people have raised as their religious exemption that they don't want to take a vaccine, that in the case of the mRNA vaccines, while they're not produced on a fetal cell line, an aborted fetal cell line platform, they were developed and researched partially on those, and that is an objection that people state they have. Yeah. And then what some of these bosses are saying is, okay, good. Under our employee benefits plan, our health plan that you're a member of, we're not going to pay for Tylenol. Well, Tylenol you wouldn't pay for over the counter, but any generic or other drug that's produced on a platform or is researched on a platform, which is like the majority of drugs, we're not going to pay for those because we just want you to be consistent. Wink, wink. And I don't know whether they would get away from that, but I thought that's pretty cute, don't you?
Yeah, it does put a spotlight on the validity of that, or the veracity of their claim.
But it's funny
that this is where we are at this point in this conversation, where we're talking about things we never thought we would talk about.
Yeah, and I've seen stories out of the UK published in peer medical journals saying, what is wrong with you guys in the US that you don't recognize natural immunity as having some cred? It gives you cred. You got corona cred, I just don't
and we
get
still
it.
have some of the best studies that support it are coming out of our country.
Yeah,
I mean, it's incredible. And it's been back to the beginning. They can go all the way back to Italy, some of the earliest, hardest hit places, and they go and they check the people and they still have immunity. And so a lot of in the mainstream conversation, resistance to accounting for it has been, well, we don't know how long it'll last. We also didn't know how long the vaccines would be effective for. And as it turns out, J&J just this week said you should come out and get a booster after 2 months. I mean, so that's not very genuine, I would say.
No, and look, I'm on record as saying, look, if you want to have extra certainty, there is nothing wrong with getting a booster. Pick the number 6 to 12 months after you've had an infection, particularly if it was a mild infection, and you want just some assurance. I've been asking people who don't want to get a booster for whatever reason to really consider when a Delta specific variant booster comes out. That would be the time. Just like, okay, I had influenza a year or two ago and I hadn't gotten the vaccine. I think I might get a booster. Get the new version, the latest, greatest influenza vaccine.
Right.
We're used to doing that, and I think that would be a common sense approach for people to take as well. There's some reason to this.
Well, of course, yeah. And I think we would get more buy-in from people if we, in general, especially all the healthcare professionals who we need very much and are in short supply, if we would have a conversation that accounted for all the body of science related to this. Yeah. And you've got
talking with Paul Seegert.
Religious.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say, before it slips my mind, that religious exemption that you brought up, 13 states now are requiring healthcare as of, I think yesterday or today, healthcare workers to get the vaccine. 3 of them are not accepting religious exemptions in the process.
Oh, wow. Well, that's going to get them in trouble. That's got to get them in trouble. I mean, that's a First Amendment issue there.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. Now, we're talking with Paul Seegert, and you can stay in touch with him on Twitter at @C_Seegert, SEEGERT, PCS Advisers, managing partner there, and a benefits expert. We've talked about the hammer, like you're going to get laid off, and up in New York, the governor says when you get laid off or resign or whatever, you don't get unemployment benefits. I'm thinking, wow.
You're fired for cause.
Yeah, lots of hammer. But how about some honey? Are any companies using honey and incentives to get the vaccine? And is that working?
Well, they did that largely. That was the approach. And you still have some very large employers that say, well, before the presidential announcement, which has kind of taken over the conversation. But before that, you had even some very large employers, Southwest Airlines and so on, that were saying, hey, we're going to continue to go the positive route on this in terms of how we talk to our employees about handling this and in adding encouragement. And there have been various forms of reward for getting vaccinated. It still has the glaring hole that, for the most part, these programs haven't acknowledged natural immunity. I think they would get more buy-in and so on if they did. But it'll still be a conversation in that below 100 employee market. How do we best address this? And they don't necessarily have the same resources to manage a program and with the stick involved and all the requirements. So I think they'll get better results likely by encouraging. The other argument is the data is saying, hey, the last few holdouts that, depending who you read, 20 to 30% they're not going to be, they didn't do it for a $100 gift card, they're not going to do it for $1,000.
Right. One thing that makes a lot of sense, and I think, again, I try to be as balls and strikes, common sense, and fair to everyone involved when we have a discussion. But I think from an employer standpoint, there's already a precedent for charging increased premiums, especially if it's an employer-sponsored health plan.
Right. Increased
premiums, or on the other hand, not giving discounts for people that either engage in high-cost health-related activities like smoking, overweight, not watching your blood pressure, controlling your diabetes. Or on the other hand, if you are smoking and then you stop smoking, you get a premium discount, your share of the healthcare premium. I think, was it Delta that did that originally. Some airline I thought did that, where they just there was a surcharge if you weren't vaccinated, because after all, it costs the company in direct costs when you get sick, even if you're mildly ill, because you're going to have to pay for some, care,
Yeah.
And on the other end, there's indirect cost with overtime for other workers that have to pick up the speed or pick up the load, or temporary workers. So to me, that's sort of a reasonable consequences of your action, sort of a freedom and responsibility thing that I would think most conservatives should be comfortable with. What say you?
Yeah, it's, I think, a well-worn path, and it makes sense. It's 30% is what the kind of the standard has been since the Affordable Care Act kicked in, that you could increase the premium deduction by as much as 30% of the total for those types of behaviors. Smoking surcharges are a really good example that's very established. And then I think so long as they were to account for national immunity in the process, they could get buy-in from the majority of people.
Yeah, good idea. Good idea. Hey, well, it's always great to talk with you. We haven't talked in a while. We'll stay in touch as the wars over employment rules and presidential mandates and science and public policy all intersect. It's an interesting time, and I know that the HR world and the benefits world is something that strikes fear into the hearts and minds of all leaders, and at the other time confuses employees too. And I know you're always looking out for it for both sides to make sure everyone gets treated fairly. Paul Seegert, thanks for being with us, my friend. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.